Thanks. All right, well, good morning. It's a few minutes after 10. I know worship got out a little bit late, but we're going to go ahead and get started. If you could take your seats, please. So I was not at first service, but I got to admit I was a little nervous when I walked up and I heard singing. I always get more out of teaching than sitting in class, so this has been a blessing for me. I hope it's been a blessing for you. And I say bittersweet because for those that are taught also know that it's a lot of work, time, effort, and energy when you teach a class. And I think twice this quarter, I think I was able to make it to church with the family. But when you've got to start on time, you got to start on time, and so it'll be nice to be able to get back into that family rhythm and showing up together at church instead of fragmented. But again, I've really enjoyed it this quarter. I hope you've learned something. And I'm excited for our last class, and we'll get into it this morning. But it's one that from the beginning of this class that I really wanted to teach. It's a book that's very near and dear to my heart, and I hope, if you're not familiar with it, I hope you get a little bit of hope out of it as we get into it today. But for those that maybe haven't been with us, or maybe you only got one or two classes, kind of our approach for this quarter was trying to find a way to give context to this moment that we find ourselves in. There's so much going on in the world, especially with the pandemic. If you've been watching the news over the weekend, there's a new variant that's starting to spread around the world called Omicron, because we're still sticking with the Greek letters. But that's causing some people to start to worry and maybe panic. There's been a lot of dissent. There's been a lot of political turmoil in our country. Some of it's hit close to home. If you look around town, you can see the homeless situation in the city is maybe getting out of hand. And every one of those people that you see out there on the streets, that's somebody, it's a life. It's a child of God that has a story. And again, some of that hits close to home. And so our goal with this class was to go to the Bible, to find stories of real people living in different times than ours, but living through similar circumstances, and to see how in those moments of crisis, when they were at the breaking point, how they were able to stay the course, maintain their faith, and maintain their relationship with God. And with that is not only finding examples of hope for ourselves, but finding these stories that we can go to encourage others. So as those around us, maybe you've got a great situation right now, maybe your job is stable, your life is great, but people around you are hurting. And so the goal was to also equip each and every one of us to have these stories that we can turn to give others that same hope that we have. So we kind of created this wheel as we went, just to try to capture some of the lessons that we've learned. And I'm going to come back to this at the end. But last week we talked about being prayerful with David. And as we've kind of expanded our circle a little bit, mostly because we ran out of room, but these last three lessons, we really wanted to focus on some of these truths that undergird everything else. So with Paul, it was this idea of learning to be content. We looked in 2 Corinthians 11 and 12, everything that Paul went through in his ministry. Just being beaten near death, shipwrecked multiple times, always on the run, always being persecuted. And he learned to be content by fixating his hope on Christ. Last week we talked about David. And throughout David's life, especially before he was anointed king officially, he was constantly on the run, life in jeopardy, being chased. And throughout that, he continually looked to God. And we saw how he would use these psalms or these prayers to refocus himself and recenter himself. And that's a lesson that we all need to learn. And every one of these people that we've looked at through this quarter, everyone that's up there, Elijah, the disciples, Jesus, the people that he healed, Job, Moses, Naomi, Jeremiah, when things got tough, the ones that endured turned to God. And they also had that relationship with God to begin with, that prayerful relationship that was there when they needed it. So today we're going to look at the book of Habakkuk and his crisis of faith. If you're not familiar with Habakkuk, go to the New Testament, the book of Matthew, and turn back about 20 pages. That should get you in the ballpark. It's one of the minor prophets. It's only 3 chapters. So if you're just kind of thumbing through your Bible, you're likely to flip past it. But it's one of my favorite books. Before we jump in, we've asked this question at most of the classes. It's been one of my favorite things is, what do you know about Habakkuk? We asked it about David, Moses. And I like it because it always amazes me what answers we get. But this one's a little bit more obscure, but what do you guys know about Habakkuk? He has some complaints, yeah. And it's a bit of a trick question, too, because we really don't know much about Habakkuk the man. We know about the 3 chapters in the book, but we can't go to any of the other narratives in the Bible to learn about him, about his past. He doesn't even say where he's from. We can guess he apparently lived in the time of Judah, or in the tribe of Judah, in that area. We know from what he talks about that he prophesied after Israel fell to Assyria, but before Babylon took Judah. So that kind of dates him probably closer to 597. When you look at the climate, what he describes, it's probably after Josiah. So if you know King Josiah, he was one of the last, or I think probably the last good king in Israel. He was one of the kings that when he took the throne as an 8-year-old, he realized that Judah was on the wrong track. And so he reformed the country, turned them back to God, got rid of all the false idols, and uncovered the law, celebrated the Passover, did some amazing things. His son only reigned for a few months and then was deposed by Egypt, who instilled Jehoiakim as the king from about 609 to 597. And then that was right up when Babylon took Judah. So this was a time of turmoil. If you were around for the class on Jeremiah, he was a contemporary of Jeremiah. Again, so those prophecies about Judah's impending doom at the hands of the Babylon was starting to take up at this period. He's also unique among the prophetic books. One of the things that makes him unique is most of the prophets we read about are taking a message from God to the people. Habakkuk, though, is taking this message from the righteous people to God. So he's kind of inverted the normal script that we see for prophets, but it's still a very, very powerful book. The other fact that I found interesting, when I first started studying this book for this class, I had Marie read through it with me a couple times. And after she read through it a few times, she's like, man, it just feels like getting hugged by God when you read this book. And I thought that was hilarious because Habakkuk, his name actually means to embrace. So it's kind of interesting that, that's his namesake. And again, I hope you get that sense from studying this book that it really does feel like a hug from God, like everything's going to be okay. We're going to get through this. So a little bit on the context. So I like this from the New American Commentary. This sets the stage. As I mentioned, the northern tribes have fallen. Assyria, who wiped out the northern tribes, has been on the decline. But as they're declining, Babylon is rising. Through that period, while Josiah is king, Israel experiences some peace. But then as Assyria is falling, Egypt, who used to kind of have some decent relationships with Assyria, realizes Babylon's not going to be so friendly. So Egypt comes up. It was actually the Egyptian Pharaoh Necho, I think it was, that killed Josiah. And then they're kind of trying to court Judah onto their side to stand up against the Babylonians, trying to use them as a vassal state, all those things that they did back in those times. And it created all this political turmoil, and I like the way they describe this. These catastrophic events of the last decades of the 7th century BC, the first decades of the 6th century BC, left many people reeling and disillusioned. And again, remember, this is after with Josiah, things were on the uptick. It's starting to look like the days of old. Things were prospering. The people turned back to God. But then after he died, things fall apart. It was an agitated time characterized by rapid political change, international turmoil, bloody military encounters, and a growing rebellion against the demands of the covenant by the great majority of Judah. Does that sound like today? I mean, all those words, like we could say, man, that sounds like the time that we're living in. And obviously the specifics were a little different, but I hope you can see we can relate to the time that Habakkuk is living in. Prophetic activity was feverish, not only with the ministries of people like Jeremiah, Nahum, Zephaniah, Huldah, and Ezekiel, but also with false prophets in abundance. And that's another thing I think that's important to keep in mind is that every time we have this rise and uptick in the prophets, it seems like inevitably you also have false prophets on the rise, trying to steer the people away from God. All right, so surely you can't be serious when God answers. As we get into the text, one of the things I love about this book is so often we read prayers from people that just kind of, they're left hanging. And maybe we see in their life the way God answered, and maybe that's the way we feel. But it's very rare that God actually speaks directly to answer your prayer. And we get that in this book, and that's one of the reasons I find it so interesting. All right, so Habakkuk starts out chapter 1, and again, if you have your Bibles, please open it. I've got a lot of the verses up here, but not all of them. So he says, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted." So just this opening chapter, for those that were here through some of the classes, who does this remind you? Who does this sound like? Who was here last week? Yeah. I was thinking specifically Psalm 13 that we looked at last week. I mean, it's almost verbatim, like, how long, O Lord? How long will you turn away from us? So why does Habakkuk speak to God this way, do you think? Because I know for those over here last week, we talked about when you read some of those prayers, I don't know about you, but I wasn't taught to pray this way. What are you doing, God? How can you just turn your back on us like this? But here we have Habakkuk, just like David.
Because of the things that's going on around him.
Yeah.
And the church, the nation is being going downhill. So, God, what are you going to do?
Right. Yeah, and it's good that he's looking to God. Yeah. Anything else?
Habakkuk doesn't think that this is fair. He doesn't think this is right. And he believes God's on the throne, and so if God's on the throne, how can this be?
Yeah.
And so he asks God.
Yeah, how can you allow this? And who is he complaining about, if we go back? Who's he complaining about here? Is that? I couldn't quite make out any of the answers. Anybody?
About God, not him.
He's complaining about God, and where's the corruption taking place? This is in Judah. He's not complaining about the Babylonians here. He's not complaining about the Assyrians or the Egyptians. He's talking about in Judah. He's talking about the law is paralyzed. Your law, God, is paralyzed in the land. We're supposed to be your people, and all that's around me is corruption, which is interesting.
Yes, it comes from within all of us, and from within any working unit. You take your car, how does it break down? It starts with one unit within there, and then you got to fix your car, right?
Right. And in this case, I think a lot of it stems from the top, where the king is wicked, and now that trickles down. But sometimes it does start with the people, and it trickles up.
The carburetor's not working.
That's right. The carburetor is definitely not working. But as we start the book out, Habakkuk is upset by the injustice that's going on around him in Judah, in the land. You know, God's people have turned corrupt, and he's complaining to God, like, God, how are you going to let this happen? This reminds me kind of when we talked about the whole honor and shame concept in Moses' day. How Moses, time and again, was looking to God like, God, what are the people going to think of you? We're your people if you destroy us. And Habakkuk's kind of appealing on the same thing, like, God, we're your people, and we're so corrupt. What are you going to do? Are you just going to sit back and let us get corrupt like this? And I think that's an interesting point, because this is a good question for us. So what are some ways that we can respond to sin and corruption in our society today? Take a breath of fresh air, which probably means maybe disconnect from social media and the news for a bit. Yes, separate from the situation. Yeah.
You feed the spiritual part of you and godliness rather than the manly side and the world. You draw near to God, and He will draw near to you.
That's right. Yeah.
And then in fellowship sweet, we will sit at His feet, or we'll walk by His side in the way.
That's right. But yeah, we talked about it after the last lesson, but just a little sidebar. Learning hymns, committing those to heart is another great way to prepare yourself for when things fall apart. But what are some ways that we can respond to sin and corruption? Because does everyone agree that there's a lot of sin and corruption in our society? We claim to be a Christian nation, but when you look around at what our country values as a whole, we were founded on Christian values, but when you look at how that's been corrupted over the years, it is disheartening. So what are some ways that we can respond to that? So you mentioned disconnecting, which I think is great, is to get ourselves right. But what are some other ways that we can engage society in a meaningful way?
We need to keep in mind that God is still in control.
Yep.
And we need to remember that sometimes He's trying to teach us lessons, and that we often turn to God due to adversity rather than everything going well.
Yes. Yeah, and that is one of the struggles, is that turning to God when things are bad instead of when things are going well. And I think that's what our country's done. When we were succeeding and when things were going well, we started to turn away from God. And now that things are difficult, more and more people, I think, are starting to look towards God.
To recognize that this is a spiritual battle.
Yes.
This is not a physical battle. We don't stand up against the sin and corruption and fight a physical war with physical weapons. We fight with spiritual weapons.
Yep.
Prayer and with the word, and that's how we fight the kind of evil that's in our world.
Absolutely. Yeah, if we don't recognize that it's a spiritual battle, we'll be fighting the wrong battles, fighting the wrong war. And that's what we see Habakkuk doing here too, right? He's going to God. He's praying to God, which is one of the most powerful spiritual weapons we have, is prayer.
Yeah.
Did you? Oh, I have one back there.
Yeah, if you stay rooted and grounded in God, I don't think you have to worry about nothing else like that.
Yeah, staying rooted and grounded in God. That's where we. Absolutely.
Sometimes when you say something out loud, you'll have a better understanding of what you're saying.
Yeah.
And what he said to God is, God, what's going on here? This is not happening the way it's supposed to happen according to me.
Yeah.
But as soon as you say that out loud, you realize, wait a second.
Yeah.
It's not about me. And he even says that. Why do you make me look at injustice?
Right. Yeah.
It's all about me. And I think that's what's great about this
Yep.
book is that he's making his complaint the way we would.
Yes.
And then I'm sure you're going to get to God's answer.
Right, absolutely, and that's a great point. And that's one of the other things I wanted to help us see here is, this was one of the main points we hit with Job, is that in the crisis of faith in Job is this kind of close to reality, but slightly altered worldview of the way things should be. And we make these assumptions and perceptions on the way God should react with humanity. This, you do good, you get good, you do bad, you get bad. And when we look at the world, we don't always see that. And so it's easy to get hung up on that, which is, I think, a little bit what Habakkuk is doing here. He's looking at the world around him. He's like, God, this is a mess. Why are you doing this? And I think part of it is because his perspective is off a little bit. And then God answers. So if you have your Bibles, starting in verse 5, the Lord answers. He says, look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded, for I'm doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They're dreaded and fearsome. Their injustice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on, guilty men whose own might is their God. Do you think this is the answer that Habakkuk was expecting? No. He's like, God, your people, we're a mess. And he's like, all right, let me tell you what's going on, Habakkuk. Hear me out. Babylon. They're going to come in and just wipe everything out because that's what they do. That is not the answer that Habakkuk was expecting.
But the point is, whenever we go through trials, whatever they are, we still need to look for that wonder and be astounded because God's at work, even though we don't believe it.
Right.
He's at work.
Yes.
And so
Yeah.
we need to be looking for the things, how God is
And that's mind-blowing at times. And that's not the answer we want. And so the question I would ask you is, what's an appropriate response when we don't like God's answers to our questions? When we pray to God and we're like, God, this is a mess, fix this. And then the answer that God gives us, like, hey, God, our country's a mess. And God's like, watch this, China. Like, no, that's not what I meant. Like, that's not what we want to hear. But what's an appropriate response when we don't like God's answer to our questions? Wait.
We'll probably complain again like that.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's important, though, where we complain? To God. Lift those complaints up to God. Absolutely. All right, so Habakkuk then goes on and replies. He says, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you've ordained them as a judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for reproof. You who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? You make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in the dragnet, so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his dragnet. For by them he lives in luxury, and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? So what he's saying here is, the Babylonians, they kind of lived on the area of the Tigris and Euphrates, nearing the Persian Gulf. So they were fishing was one of their big commodities. So he's using that as an example. Like, they're gathering the nations up like fish and just killing them with their hooks, living in luxury, taking advantage of everyone. And that one in there, he's like, God, how are you going to let these wicked people swallow up people more righteous than they are? He's like, God, I know I was talking about how bad we were, but come on. These guys are way worse.
Might be a good point. God uses one wicked nation to destroy another wicked nation.
Yes, that's another way to look at it. But Habakkuk knows that these are God's chosen people. This isn't just any wicked nation. This is a nation that should not be wicked, and that's the problem he wants to correct. But then he continues. He says, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. So what do you think about Habakkuk's approach here? I know Kitty agrees. Waiting.
Still don't understand.
I still don't understand. And I love the way he says that at the end. I will answer, and then I'm going to think about what I'm going to answer concerning my complaint. So I can just picture him up there on the wall, waiting on God, and just having this conversation with God over and over in his head, where God's going to be like, Babylon this. And he's like, oh yeah, God, well this. And what about that? And what about this? He's thinking about this conversation that he's going to have with God. But that's his approach, and I think that's a good one. It's good for us to remember this idea of, again, waiting on God. When we don't understand and we don't know what to do, just wait. So I think that's a pretty decent approach. And so then, picking up in chapter 2, the Lord answers. The Lord answers again. And he says, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end, it will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come, it will not delay. So God tells him, he's like, I'm going to give you a vision, write it down, and trust me. It's going to come, it's not going to delay. What he means there is he's not necessarily it's going to come now, but it's not going to delay from God's time. God has a plan, God knows what he's doing, and he's like, this plan is going to happen, and it's going to happen on my time. So watch and wait.
But we want an answer now.
Yes.
We want it solved now.
Yes. We want to know the answer now, and we want the solution now. And not just, here's what's going to happen, here's your answer 20 years later. Like, no. Yes. Waiting. And then we get this verse. So as God goes into this vision, we get this verse in chapter 2, verse 4. He says, behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him. Talking about Babylon now. But the righteous shall live by his faith. This is maybe a familiar verse. This one's quoted several times in the New Testament. And I was kind of interested to find that, Paul quotes this several times. And he was quoting from Habakkuk. The righteous will live by faith. So God is saying, you're looking at this nation, they're puffed up. But he's saying, if you're righteous, I'm asking you to trust me. Walk by faith. And so then God continues. And now for the rest of chapter 2, God goes on with these woes about Babylon. And it's not just Babylon. This is, you can kind of take these as general woes when he says, woe to him who heaps up what is not his own, in verse 6. For how long? And loads himself with pledges. Will not your debtors suddenly arise, and those awake who will make you tremble? Then you will be spoil for them. And then he goes on and he says, woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to set his nest on high, to be safe from the reach of harm. Woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. And then right in the midst of these woes, in verse 14, he says, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the water covers the sea. So as he's talking about these woes about this nation, he's like, by the way, the knowledge of the Lord is going to cover the earth. Everyone's going to know about God. But in the meantime, woe to these people that are living like this, that are doing these things. And he continues, woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. You will have your fill of shame instead of glory. And then I love as he kind of goes into close, as he's talking about all these horrible things he does, that they're doing. And again, it's this idea that, like, woe to them. They're going to get what's theirs. They're sowing these seeds. They're going to reap a harvest, and it's not going to be pretty when it happens. But then as he closes, he says, what profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it, a metal image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breadth in it at all. So there's this little woe to idolaters. And this one really struck me as I was studying through this recently. In what ways do we trust our own creation and forget our Creator in the modern world today? Science? And it can depend on science how we approach it. Because if we approach science on trying to learn God and learn his ways, it can be a beautiful study and a beautiful thing. But if we approach science as I'm going to grow knowledge so that I can manipulate the world and manipulate God's creation, that's when it can become a problem. Or when we trust what we see more than we trust God. What else? Wealth, yes. We trust in our wealth. Security. We think that amassing a lot of money gives us security. That doesn't always work out. Usually it doesn't work out. Medicine. And that kind of goes along with science, yeah. We think that we can just extend our lives, and that we can control our lives and our health.
Yeah, Brandon is right. Most people hung up on money.
Money, yeah. Money, wealth, again, yep. Anything else? What hit me as I was reading through this, talking about, making this image a teacher of lies, trusting his own creation. Can this teach? The internet. It's almost like the internet, it's almost like a modern day Tower of Babel where we're trying to, instead of being this omnipresence on the tower, we're trying to be omniscient like God. But the problem is when you look at the internet, it's a mirror of us. There's so much good and creativity that's in there, just like there's so much good in us that God put in there. But there's so much evil and wickedness there too. And we think that this is going to solve all our problems by amassing this knowledge, that if we just put all of mankind's knowledge in one place where we can access it whenever we want, that somehow that's going to solve all the world's problems. But if we're starting with man and we're starting with our own wisdom, this thing that we've created, this God that we've created, is not going to solve our problems.
I think we went through it last week or week before somewhere. What profiteth a man if he gain the whole world and yet forfeit his soul?
That's right. If we gain the whole world and forfeit our soul, we get nothing in the end. But anyways, I thought that was interesting because, again, it's easy when you read this description about, carving things out of wood and metal. It's easy to get caught up in this idea of actually building statues and bowing down and worshiping. And we think of that as some petty thing like, oh, yeah, we don't do that today. We're way beyond that. But we do this in our own way, in our own time. We create things in this world, whether it's scientific method, new medical breakthroughs, Bitcoin, we've got this new blockchain thing where we can secure it all and everything. It's amazing. And we think that's going to give us security. But none of those things are going to give us security. It comes from God. And then chapter 2 ends with this verse, but the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Exclamation point. Period. So after he talks about, idols and how worthless they are, he's like, God is in his temple. All the earth just needs to be quiet. and wait. So I just wanted to do a brief recap, just so you know, again, where we are at this point in the book. So we have, Habakkuk takes his complaint about Judah's wickedness to God, right? He's like, God, the people are wicked. Your people are wicked. Do something. And then God answers, I'm sending Babylon to fix this. And then Habakkuk doesn't like this because he says, hey, whoa, they're worse than we are. That is not a good answer. So God reminds Habakkuk, that's right. And they're going to get what they deserve in the end. But for now, just trust me and walk by faith. And so if you're Habakkuk at this point, you've actually had this opportunity to have this dialogue with God, but you're still maybe a little uncertain of God's answers. So what are you thinking at this point? God is in his holy temple, and we just need to be silent. And you're probably meditating on that last little piece, like, be silent. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
We need to remember that God is in control, because we like to take the control over.
Yeah.
Take it from God.
Yep. We want God to give us control. I think most of us, if we were honest, we want God to say, like, here you go, here's the wheel. Just go ahead, have at it. But God says, no, give me the wheel. Yep. Any other thoughts?
I think though in our life, I know in the military we were taught, what's the problem and then what's the solution?
Yes.
That's what the general always asks.
Right.
And we think we have the solution to everything.
Right.
When God has the solution. And we don't understand that.
Right.
It's his ways above ours.
Yes. And I've also learned, too, on that note, in the military over the years, is that you can have the right solution to the problem, but if you've identified the wrong problem, it's a waste of time if you're fixing the wrong thing. And we do that, too. And in some ways, that's where Habakkuk starts, where he thinks the problem is just, the wickedness of the people, and that, wants God to come in and fix it. And God's like, I got a bigger plan. So he's kind of focused on the wrong thing, and God's trying to redirect him here, which is pretty awesome. So now as the book closes out in chapter 3, Habakkuk has this vision of God. So after this vision where God tells him all these woes about Babylon, and he's like, hey, they're going to get theirs, but just trust me. God is in his temple. Then it says at chapter 3, verse 1, it says this is a prayer of Habakkuk, but as you read through, you see this is this vision that he has of God. He says, O Lord, I've heard the report of you and your work. O Lord, do I fear in the midst of years, revive it. O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. And then he continues. Where to go? I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers, or your indignation against the sea? When you rode on your horses, on your chariot of salvation, you stripped the sheath from your bow, calling for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers. And then he continues in verse 10. He says, the mountains saw you and writhed. The raging waters swept on. The deep gave forth its voice. It lifted its hands on high. I don't know about you, when I read that, I get chills. The deep gives forth its voice. I think Marie, when we were reading that, she pointed that out. She's just like, what does that even sound like? He's talking about like the oceans and the sea and like the deep giving forth its voice. And when you really stop and think about that, that's terrifying. And so he continues, the sun and moon stood still in their place. At the light of your arrows they sped. At the flash of your glittering spear, you marched through the earth in fury. You threshed the nations in anger. You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. You pierced with his own arrows the heads of his warriors, who came like a whirlwind to scatter me. Rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret, you trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters. So, again, I love this picture here because Sometimes I think when we don't know what's going on around us, we need to get a picture like this of God. You see this throughout the Bible. People like Isaiah, they come into contact with God, and it just destroys them. He just collapses over and says, I'm a dead man. In the book of Revelation, when it opens up, you have John, who had this revelation, who was one of Jesus' best friends on this earth. He has an encounter with the resurrected Jesus, and when he sees Jesus in his glory and splendor, he collapses like a dead man. And again, I think we kind of want to approach God sometimes as just, and again, we're told, to call God our daddy, father, and we have this loving relationship with him. But, for those of you, if you remember being a kid and you got your dad, especially if your dad was a bigger guy, when he'd rear up and sometimes directed at you, if it's just like, if you do that again. But other times, if you see your dad coming in to defend you, it can be a very comforting thing to have somebody that has a little bit more of a physical presence, if you will. And so again, having this picture of God, I think, is so important for us.
He's still the creator and he's still control.
He's still the creator, he's still in control, and when he comes down and when he unleashes his wrath and his fury, it is terrifying. It is terrifying. In Habakkuk in chapter 3, verse 16, he says, I hear, and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. And again, it's this idea that when we have this view of God, of this mighty, all-powerful, terrible, fearsome God, and then we realize that he's on our side, that's when it becomes comforting. And again, he says, I'm going to wait quietly for the day of trouble, because he knows now that God is not going to let Babylon run rampant. God is not going to reward Babylon for destroying Judah. They're going to get what they deserve in the end. And when it happens, it's going to be pretty awful to be Babylon. So he's content to wait now. And he ends this book with, I think, just some of the most beautiful statements of faith in the entire Bible. He says, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor the fruit be on the vines, produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's, and he makes me tread on my high places. I love that. It's just, again, it's one of the most beautiful statements of faith. It's not just like, God, I trust you. It's like, you know what, God, the world's falling apart around me. There's no food, there's famine, pestilence, plague. It's horrible out there, God, but I trust you. It doesn't matter what happens around me, God. I trust you. And that's really the big question for us in this quarter. And we talked a little bit about this last week in the context of David, and I wanted to bring this question up again. How can we, like Habakkuk, move from why, God? What are you doing? How can we move from that to, you know what, it doesn't matter. I will rejoice in the Lord when we need hope at our breaking points. How do we get from why, God, to I trust you?
Yes, and it comes from the whole song that we started with long ago that we don't do. It goes, and when we walk with the Lord in the light of his word, what a glory he sheds on our way.
Yes.
What he says we will do, where he says we will go. Never fear, only trust and obey.
Yes. I want to sing that now. Yeah, but no, I like you, and that's beautiful the way it words. It's in the light of his word, right? We go to the word for that illumination to remind us of who God is and what he's done and what he will continue to do.
Yeah, I agree. This is a matter of faith. To move on from, at the beginning, he says, God, I want you to make things the way I think, so everything makes sense to me. And in the end, it's just to leave that, I'm going to leave that in God's hands. And if things are okay, good. If things are not okay,
And the other thing I love about, Habakkuk's story is this is a process for him. He didn't just wake up in chapter 1 and be like, all right, Israel, all right, Judah, here it is, trust God, here's the plan. This book starts out with him wrestling with God. And it's a process. It's, again, this faith, getting to this point of faith and this declaration of faith at the end was not an automatic thing. He had to wrestle with God to get to that point.
The first thing you must not do is think that you cannot complain to God.
Yes.
If anyone has raised teenagers, you can tell the parent is kind of getting a little funk, whatever.
Yeah.
And you try to, get them to talk it out and share with them what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And when they start doing that, then you can help them. It's the same thing with God. We're in our little funk down here, and we're thinking, God, what's going on? This isn't right. Yeah. Until we talk to him, it's going to be very difficult for us to come to that point.
Yes, absolutely. And again, not holding back. You're not going to hurt God's feelings if you question his way of running the universe. You might not like his answer, but you're not going to hurt his feelings.
I think we can apply it to our lives too. We struggle with sin. God is our salvation, as he says in the end, and he's our strength. So even though we have the temptation, even though Satan attacks us, there's still salvation, and we have strength in him and not in ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts? So again, I'd encourage you to meditate on this question, and this is a great book. It's 3 chapters. It's easy to read. It's a great devotional when things are, maybe not going well in life. It's a great place to go. It doesn't take long to read, and you can, like Habakkuk, go on this journey of God, why is this happening? And feeling like you can take that question up to him and then get to that point of faith. So I hand back there and then over here. Yeah.
And yet he gave him a specific job to do, and then he created an ark environment for Noah. And then the imagery also seems to look forward to Revelations, like you mentioned, and we're given a parallel today of what's coming again. We don't know when, but it's coming. We need to get on the ark. We need to figure out who can we amass together with us to get on the ark, and that's our job. So I think being trapped in the why, not the question, if we can instead focus our efforts on, am I prepared to get on the ark, and who can I collect together to get on this ark? Because he is coming again, and he's doing all these tremendous things that are written in this language that is kind of overwhelming when you really think about it.
Yeah. No, that's a... Yeah. But no, that's a great point. If you couldn't hear on this side, just she was pointing out how that imagery at the end of chapter 3 where it talks about the waters and the earth, just how that carries that same imagery back to Noah's day, and just how, again, not unlike with Habakkuk where God's like, here's the plan, I'm going to destroy the earth. Noah didn't change God's mind, but God gave him a path to salvation, which is in a lot of ways what God is doing here with Habakkuk. And that's what he does with us today too. We may see the world falling apart around us, but God gives us that path, that hope of salvation. Did you still have a comment? That's such a beautiful image that, God's seeing his reflection in us through that refinement process. And I know we talked about that through this course, but just praying that when you are suffering, when you are going through points like this at the breaking point, praying that God will use it to help you grow. Because if you go through something like this and you look back on and the best you can say is that I survived, that's a wasted opportunity in a lot of times. So I think one more comment back there, and then we've got to move on.
I was just going to say, I
Yes. Yeah, and that's where I love the Psalms too, because there's so much power and just raw emotion there. I'd love to keep talking about this, but for time's sake, we gotta wrap up. So, just some of the lessons that I took away from this, and we already touched on these, but pray for restoration. When we talk about the world, we need to be praying for restoration. We shouldn't be complaining to one another about how terrible things are. Fine, do that if it helps you. But we need to be praying for restoration and not settling for injustice in the world around us. And like David last week, we talked about this, but don't hold back even your disappointment with God. Take it to him. He can handle it, and it'll make you, he will use that to point you down the right path. And then wait for God. Trust his timing. It's not ours. We don't like waiting. We don't like it when God tells us to wait, but we need to learn to walk by faith and trust his timing. And then that vision of God in chapter 3, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Our problems shrink away in the presence of a mighty, powerful God. And if we don't have that image of a mighty, powerful God like Habakkuk does, like Isaiah did, like John did, all throughout the Bible, the Red Sea, if we don't have that image of a mighty and powerful God, our problems are going to seem bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I want to leave with this thought. In Wiersbe's commentary on Habakkuk, he said his circumstances hadn't changed, but he had changed. And now he was walking by faith instead of sight. He was living by promises, not explanations. And I know in this day of the internet, of science and medicine, we want explanations. We think we can answer every question. But we need to learn to live by God's promises, to walk by faith. He doesn't owe us answers for everything he does. And honestly, as we see in this book, we probably wouldn't like him if he gave them to us. But we need to learn to trust him, to walk by faith. And then Paul sums it up as, just to kind of wrap up this class on hope. I love what Paul says here. He says, "For in this hope we were saved." Now, hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes in what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. So my prayer for us is that we can learn to wait on God with patience. And again, I hope that this class has been helpful for you, for those of you that have been struggling over these last year and a half, maybe longer. And for those of you that have a difficult ahead that don't know it yet, I hope some of these stories, some of these biblical principles will stay with you. And I hope that you can share them with others. And as those around you struggle, that you can also help them find hope and find encouragement through the Word. So we end with being faithful. And I want to close in a word of prayer. And I also just wanted to throw in a plug. As I mentioned, this is our last class. So next week, we're down to one service. And then we'll have a class before that service. Ken Hines will be preaching on love in the Bible. And Dan's going to be in the fellowship hall teaching on the miracles of Christ, correct? So I'd encourage you to continue to come participate in the Bible studies. It'll definitely be an encouragement. So let's close in a word of prayer. Lord God, we just want to thank you so much for your word. And we want to thank you for this vision, this interaction that we get to read about where you answered Habakkuk. God, the fact that you would descend to earth and to talk to us, to share with us, to reveal your word to us, and the fact that you would reveal your intentions to us is just incredible. We're so lowly compared to you, Lord, and again, it just goes to show how loving you are, how merciful and tender you are. And I pray, Lord, that you would help us to see that. I pray that your word would penetrate our hearts in a way that we can learn to trust you, to walk by faith. We know, Lord, that you've told us over and again that you have a plan. You have a plan for our salvation, to give us a hope and a future. We know that you work everything in our lives for the good, even when we don't see it. And Lord, it's so hard to trust and to live like that each day. But I pray that you would work on each of us. Soften us, refine us, and help us to see you, God, on your throne and to know that you're in control. Help us to not be discouraged when we look at the world around us, when we see all the pain and the brokenness. And I pray also, Lord, that you would help us to understand that you've created us and put us on this earth so that we can reflect your love and your goodness. So I pray, Lord, that you would open up our eyes for opportunities where we can be your hands and your feet, where we can take that love to a broken world. God, I pray for the church here at Southwest. I pray for Dan. I pray for Ken, that you would be with them, that your Spirit would guide them as they begin teaching this next quarter. I pray, Lord, that you would, each and every one of us, Lord, you know what message we need in our life. You know the words that we need for ourselves, for those around us. And I pray that you would guide us to the right place so that we could draw closer to you in fellowship, Lord. We love you so much. Again, we thank you for being with us this morning. We offer this prayer in your Son's name.